In 1823, a fur trapper named Hugh Glass walked into a thicket along the Grand River in what is now South Dakota and stumbled straight into a mother grizzly with 2 cubs. The bear hit him before he could raise his rifle. She slammed him to the ground, tore open his back, shredded his scalp, and broke his leg. Glass pulled his knife and stabbed her over and over until his companions arrived and shot the animal dead. It took 3 men to roll the grizzly off his body. Glass was still breathing, barely, so the expedition leader Andrew Henry offered to pay 2 men to stay behind and bury him once he finally stopped. John Fitzgerald and a teenager widely believed to be a young Jim Bridger volunteered. That was late August, 1823. By early October, Glass limped into Fort Kiowa, more than 200 miles away. He had crawled across the open prairie, eaten roots and berries and raw rattlesnake, let maggots clean the rotting flesh from his wounds, and floated downriver on a makeshift raft. But the 2 men who stayed behind had not waited for him to die. After 5 days, they took his rifle, his knife, his tomahawk, and his fire-making kit, and they left. That moment, the one where Glass woke up stripped of every tool he needed to stay alive, is the most famous survival story in the history of the American frontier. And it tells you everything about what mattered to a mountain man, not the buckskin jacket, not the coonskin cap, the tools. Because between 1810 and 1840, a small brotherhood of trappers and hunters lived year-round in the Rocky Mountains, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, surrounded by grizzlies, wolves, blizzards, and occasionally hostile tribes. The only thing standing between them and a lonely death were a handful of hand-forged objects they carried everywhere they went. These are the 7 tools that kept mountain men alive. Number 1. The Possibles Bag. Before we talk about any individual tool, we need to talk about the thing that held them all together. Every mountain man carried a leather pouch slung across his body, usually made from heavy tanned hide, pressed tight against his side every minute of the day. They called it the Possibles Bag, and inside it was every small object a trapper needed to keep himself alive and working in the wilderness. Black powder, lead balls, a powder measurer, patching material, a small patch knife, fire-making supplies, sometimes an awl for punching holes in leather, because if your moccasins fell apart 50 miles from camp, you needed to sew new ones from whatever hide you had. The name itself tells you everything about the mindset. It held your possibles, meaning everything that made survival possible. And you never, under any circumstances, took it off. A trapper eating dinner kept the bag on his lap. A trapper sleeping kept it pressed against his side. The only time a mountain man separated from his Possibles Bag was if he was dead, or if someone took it from him, which is exactly what happened to Hugh Glass. When Fitzgerald and Bridger stripped Glass of his gear, the Possibles Bag was part of what they took. They left him with nothing but the clothes on his body and a creek running nearby. Every survival miracle Glass pulled off after that point, the maggot trick, the raw rattlesnake, the crawl across the plains, happened because 2 men decided a dying trapper did not need his Possibles Bag anymore. They were wrong. The Possibles Bag also served as a kind of portable identity. At rendezvous, a mountain man's bag told other trappers what kind of operation he was running. A well-stocked bag with extra flints, a spare patch knife, and a few trade goods like fire steels or small silver ornaments meant a trapper who planned ahead, who respected the mountains enough to prepare for what they could throw at him. A thin bag with nothing but a handful of loose balls and some damp powder meant trouble. Other trappers would size a man up by his kit before they would size him up by his handshake. And there was one specific tool inside that bag, carried on the belt and not in the pouch, that served as the mountain man's Swiss Army knife centuries before that phrase existed. Number 2. The tomahawk. If you picture a tomahawk, you are probably imagining a weapon. And it was. A mountain man cornered by a bear or ambushed on a trail would swing a tomahawk before he reached for anything else, because in close quarters, it was faster and more reliable than trying to reload a muzzleloader. But calling the tomahawk just a weapon misses the point entirely. Out in the Rockies, a tomahawk was a carpenter's hammer, a splitting maul, a shelter-building tool, and an icebreaker, all wrapped into one iron head on a hickory handle. Mountain men used tomahawks to chop firewood when temperatures dropped below zero in the mountain passes. They used them to drive wooden stakes into frozen ground for shelter frames. They used them to crack through ice on streams and rivers so they could reach water or set traps underneath. The tomahawk was also one of the most valued trade items between mountain men and Native American tribes. Iron tomahawk heads were forged at frontier blacksmith shops and shipped west by the crate. At Rendezvous, the annual gathering where trappers traded their furs for supplies, tomahawks moved between cultures constantly. For the tribes, an iron tomahawk replaced stone tools that took days to shape. For the trapper, a good trade relationship with a local tribe could mean the difference between getting directions to beaver-rich streams or getting ambushed on a trail. The axe, in every form, has been a frontier essential since the earliest colonial settlements. But the tomahawk earned its place in the mountain man's kit because it was lighter and faster than a full-sized axe while still doing 90% of the same work. A trapper could swing a tomahawk one-handed while holding a rifle in the other. He could throw it if he needed to, and he could tuck it into his belt and forget about it until the moment he needed it, which in the Rockies could be any moment at all. And this next tool is the reason any of those trades happened in the first place. Number 3. The Beaver Trap. Mountain men did not go to the Rocky Mountains because they liked the scenery. They went because beaver pelts were worth a fortune. In the 1820s and 1830s, the European hat industry ran on beaver fur. A single beaver pelt, called a plew, could sell for $6 to $8 at Rendezvous. A good trapper pulling in 400 or more pelts a season could earn the equivalent of a year's salary in a few months of brutal, freezing, dangerous work. The tool that made all of that money possible was a 6-pound iron contraption with steel jaws strong enough to snap bone. The standard beaver trap of the era, most commonly the Newhouse design, was set underwater in a stream or pond, staked into the mud, and baited with castoreum, a musky secretion from another beaver's glands. Setting these traps was miserable. Trappers waded into ice-cold streams before dawn, sometimes waist-deep, planting their trap lines and checking them by feel because the water was too murky to see. They carried 6 traps on average, stored in a leather sack called a trap sack, and each trap weighed enough that just hauling them through mountain terrain was a full-body workout. But the trap was what paid for everything. The rifle, the powder, the lead, the coffee, the tobacco, the replacement clothes, all of it came through beaver pelts. Lose your traps and you lost your income. And in the mountains, losing your income meant losing your ability to resupply at Rendezvous, which meant losing your ability to survive the following winter. The relationship between a mountain man and his trap line was punishing and intimate. He memorized the feel of every stream bottom, learned where beaver built their dams by reading the landscape for chewed stumps and mudslides, and woke before sunrise every morning to check his sets. If a beaver had sprung the trap overnight, the trapper waded in, retrieved the animal, reset the trap, and hauled the carcass back to camp for skinning. If the trap was empty, he reset it anyway, sometimes adjusting the position by inches based on how the water was flowing. The whole cycle repeated every single morning. Rain, snow, ice, it did not matter. A trapper who skipped his trap line lost pelts, and lost pelts meant lost income. By the time the fur trade peaked in the 1830s, the annual value of furs being traded out of the Rockies had climbed past $1 million. And every cent of that money moved through the jaws of iron traps like these, set by men standing waist-deep in mountain streams at 4 in the morning. Number 4. Flint and Steel. If you had to strip a mountain man down to one single survival tool, the experienced ones would not pick the rifle. They would not pick the knife. They would pick the fire-making kit. A piece of carbon steel, about the size of your palm, shaped in a curve so your knuckles fit inside it. A chunk of flint or chert. A small bundle of char cloth, which is cotton or linen fabric that has been slowly burned until it catches a spark instantly. Together, these 3 items weighed almost nothing and fit in the corner of a possibles bag. And they were the single most important survival tool in the mountains. Fire meant warmth on a night when the temperature dropped below freezing with no warning. Fire meant cooked food when you managed to shoot an elk or pull a fish from a stream. Fire meant boiled water, dried meat, sterilized wounds, and a signal to your party if you got separated. Fire meant survival, plain and simple, and a mountain man without his flint and steel was a dead man walking. The fire steel itself cost almost nothing in the East, a cent or two at most. Frontier blacksmiths cranked them out by the hundreds. Trading posts shipped crates of them to rendezvous every year because Native American tribes valued them just as highly as the trappers did. But once you were 300 miles into the Rockies, with the nearest blacksmith a season's travel away, that little piece of carbon steel was worth more than gold. The technique for using flint and steel was straightforward but took practice to master. You struck the steel against the sharp edge of the flint at a downward angle, throwing a shower of tiny sparks onto the char cloth. If a spark caught, the char cloth would begin to glow, a small orange ember no bigger than the head of a pin. You placed that ember into a nest of dry tinder, thinly shaved bark, dried grass, crushed cattail fluff, whatever you could gather, and blew on it gently until the tinder caught flame. In calm, dry weather, a skilled trapper could go from spark to fire in under a minute. In rain or wind, it could take much longer, and the patience it required was its own form of survival skill. Remember Hugh Glass. When he woke up after being left for dead, he had been stripped of his rifle, his knife, his tomahawk, and his fire-making kit, everything that a healthy man would need to survive. Glass later told another trapper what finding a few leftover supplies had meant to him during that crawl across the prairie. He reportedly said he felt quite rich when he found his knife, flint, and steel in his shot pouch. Those little fixins, he said, make a man feel right peart when he is 300 or 400 miles from anybody or any place. If you are finding this helpful, hit subscribe. We cover stories from the frontier every week. By 1830, the fur trade had peaked, and the mountain men who had survived that first brutal decade in the Rockies had learned hard lessons about what to carry and what to leave behind. The tools that made the cut tell you something about what actually mattered when your life was on the line. Number 5. The knife. A mountain man's knife was the most personal thing he owned. More personal than his rifle, more personal than his horse, more personal than any piece of clothing on his body. Trappers used knives for everything. Skinning beaver pelts, which required careful blade work to avoid damaging the fur. Butchering elk and deer carcasses for food. Cutting leather and sinew to repair moccasins, clothing, and saddle gear. Carving wood for trap stakes and shelter frames. Cleaning rifles. Preparing meals. And when everything else failed, self-defense. The knife a mountain man carried was so central to his identity that losing one could drive a trapper to irrational behavior. Historical accounts describe mountain men backtracking for days across dangerous territory to recover a knife that had been lost or stolen. Some risked combat over a missing blade, not because replacements did not exist, but because a man's knife was worn to his hand, sharpened to his preference, and trusted in a way that a new one from a trading post could not be. Most mountain men carried two. A larger belt knife, often called a butcher knife, hung from the heavy leather belt worn outside the shirt. This was the workhorse, the one that saw daily use skinning pelts and preparing food. A smaller patch knife lived in the possibles bag, used for delicate work like cutting cloth patches for loading the rifle or minor gear repairs. The quality of a mountain man's knife mattered enormously. Cheap trade knives with soft iron blades dulled after a few pelts and needed constant sharpening on whatever flat stone the trapper could find. Better knives, forged from high carbon steel by established cutlers in Sheffield, England, or by American blacksmiths in Street. Louis held an edge through dozens of pelts and could be resharpened to near original condition. The difference between a good knife and a bad one was the difference between spending 20 minutes on a pelt and spending an hour. And in a profession where every pelt meant money and every hour of daylight meant safety, that gap added up fast. And then there were the moments when the knife was the last line of defense. Hugh Glass, pinned under 800 pounds of grizzly, stabbed the bear repeatedly with his belt knife while she raked his body with claws and teeth. It did not kill her. His companion's rifle shots did that. but the knife kept him in the fight long enough for help to arrive. Without it, the bear would have finished the job before anyone got close. If that sounds extreme, it happened more often than you would think. Grizzly bears roamed the plains and the mountains in huge numbers during the early 1800s. Lewis and Clark's expedition documented multiple grizzly encounters, and nearly every first-hand account from the fur trade era mentions at least one close call with a bear. The knife was often the only thing a trapper could reach in time. Number 6. The powder horn and bullet mold. Your rifle is only as useful as the ammunition you can put through it. And in the 1820s, that ammunition did not come in boxes from a store. Every mountain man carried a powder horn slung over his shoulder by a leather strap. Most were made from bison horn, though steer horn was common too. The horn was hollowed out, capped at the wide end with a fitted wooden plug, and fitted with a small spout at the narrow end for measuring charges. Inside was black gunpowder, the fuel for every shot a trapper fired. Alongside the powder horn, a mountain man carried a bullet mold and bars of raw lead. When he needed ammunition, he melted the lead over a fire, poured the liquid metal into the iron mold, let it cool, and popped out a fresh round ball ready for his rifle. The size of the mold matched the caliber of the gun, and every trapper carried the exact mold his particular rifle required. Captain Benjamin Bonneville described a typical trapper's outfit in 1834. A rifle, a pound of powder, and 4 pounds of lead. That was the standard allocation. 1 pound of powder and 4 pounds of lead to keep a man fed, defended, and earning his living for an entire trapping season in the mountains. Think about that for a second. 4 pounds of lead, melted and cast 1 ball at a time over a campfire, was supposed to last a mountain man through months of hunting, defense against grizzlies, and the occasional fight. Every shot counted. Every wasted ball was one fewer between you and going hungry, or worse. Keeping the powder dry was a constant obsession. Meriwether Lewis, decades earlier during the Lewis and Clark expedition, had designed a system of lead canisters to protect his gunpowder during river crossings. The idea was simple but brilliant. The lead that encased the powder could later be melted down into bullets. When several canisters cracked or leaked during the journey, the expedition nearly lost its entire powder supply. Lewis wrote that without the precaution of sealing the powder inside the lead, they would not have had a single charge left. The mountain men who came after Lewis learned that lesson by heart. A wet powder horn meant a useless rifle. A useless rifle meant no food, no defense, and no beaver pelts. Everything downstream collapsed. That fragility is what made the annual rendezvous so critical. Every summer between 1825 and 1840, supply trains from St. Roners and Stances bring 2 Assembly stances. Louis hauled fresh powder, lead, traps, knives, cloth, tobacco, and coffee out to a prearranged meeting point in the mountains. Trappers brought their year's harvest of furs and traded them for the supplies they needed to survive another season. If the supply train was late, or if it did not come at all, trappers rationed every grain of powder and every ounce of lead until the next one arrived. Some never made it that long. The powder horn and bullet mold together formed a self-contained ammunition factory that a single man could carry on his body. As long as he had lead and powder, he could keep his rifle loaded. The moment either ran out, the countdown to disaster started. Number 7. The rifle. The rifle was the loudest, heaviest, and most expensive tool a mountain man carried. It was also the one that anchored everything else together. Most mountain men of the 1810s and 1820s carried full-stock flintlock rifles, the same basic design that American long hunters had carried across the Appalachians a generation earlier. These were long-barreled, large-caliber, muzzle-loading firearms that took roughly 30 seconds to reload and could reach out accurately to 100 yards or more in skilled hands. Loading one meant pouring a measured charge of powder down the barrel, placing a greased cloth patch over the muzzle, seating a lead ball on top of the patch, ramming it all down with a wooden rod, priming the flash pan, and cocking the hammer. In a fight, 30 seconds between shots felt like 30 minutes. In 1823, 2 brothers named Jacob and Samuel Hawken were running a gun shop in St. Louis, right at the launching point for expeditions heading into the western fur trade. They started building a new kind of rifle designed specifically for the mountain men. Shorter barrel than the old Kentucky long rifle, heavier construction, larger caliber, usually around 54 caliber, and built to survive hard use in rough terrain. They called it the Rocky Mountain Rifle. A Hawken cost about $25, which was a significant amount of money in the 1820s. Most regular flintlock rifles sold for $10 to $15. That price difference meant plenty of trappers never owned a Hawken. They carried whatever they could afford, repaired it when it broke, and replaced parts when they could trade for them at rendezvous. But for the mountain men who could afford one, the Hawken became the standard. Jim Bridger carried one. Kit Carson carried one. Hugh Glass was said to have used one. Jedediah Smith likely did as well. These rifles were not mass-produced. The Hawken brothers built each one by hand, producing around 120 rifles per year at most, peaking at maybe 200 during the gold rush years of the late 1840s. The rifle's job was simple and brutal: kill game for food, kill predators for survival, and when necessary, defend the trapper against anyone who wanted to take his furs, his tools, or his life. A mountain man who lost his rifle was in serious trouble. He could still trap with his traps, start fires with his flint and steel, and defend himself at close range with his knife and tomahawk. But without the rifle, he could not hunt elk or deer, could not hold off a threat at distance, and could not provide the one thing the wilderness demanded above all else: meat. Osborne Russell, a trapper who wrote one of the few first-person accounts of mountain man life, described holding off a determined attack by Blackfoot warriors with nothing but his horse pistol after losing his rifle. He survived, barely. But his account makes clear that the pistol was a poor substitute. The rifle was the primary tool of survival, and everything else in the mountain man's kit existed, in one way or another, to keep that rifle loaded, clean, and firing. Hugh Glass understood this better than anyone. After crawling 200 miles across the open plains, eating berries and raw snake meat, surviving on nothing but his own rage and a few recovered scraps from his possibles bag, the first thing Glass did when he reached Fort Atkinson was demand his rifle back from John Fitzgerald. The Army captain on duty returned the weapon. Glass reportedly did not care much about the rest. The rifle was not just a tool, it was the cornerstone that every other tool supported. The powder horn fed it, the bullet mold armed it, the possibles bag maintained it. The knife and tomahawk covered the gaps it could not reach, and the flint and steel kept the man behind the trigger warm, fed, and alive long enough to pull it. The peak of the Rocky Mountain fur trade lasted barely 20 years. By the 1840s, beaver populations had been trapped out across huge stretches of the mountains. The European fashion industry had moved on from beaver felt to silk. And the annual rendezvous, which had been the lifeline connecting these men to civilization, stopped happening entirely after 1840. The mountain men who survived that era scattered. Some became army scouts. Others guided wagon trains of settlers heading west along the trails those same trappers had blazed years earlier. A few stayed in the mountains and lived out their lives as hunters and hermits. Those 7 tools were it. That was the full survival kit for a man living year-round in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on the continent. No GPS, no waterproof matches, no satellite phone, just iron, steel, leather, and lead, shaped by blacksmiths in St. Louis and carried across 1,000 miles of wilderness on the back of a mule. Hugh Glass reportedly said those few small tools made him feel quite rich when he was hundreds of miles from anybody or any place, and that line says more about the mountain man era than any textbook. Because rich, for those men, did not mean gold or land or status. Rich meant having the tools to keep yourself breathing for one more day. If that era fascinates you, the video on screen right now covers the wildest survival stories from the fur trade. Click it.